There are three parts to connecting to external data in your application. You need to know how to connect to the data, you need a tool that can do the talking, and you need to know what to tell the tool to do. The first part, how to connect the data, is typically found in a connection string. That's a string that says, here is where the data is on the network or the computer, here's the specifics of how to connect to it, and here's the credentials needed to access that data. That is what we're going to be covering in this lesson. We won't be covering the other two parts, but never fear, I have a video that covers that well enough to get started even if your data storage device isn't Microsoft SQL. Check out my video on how to use Dapper to connect C# to SQL. That will show you the tool, which is Dapper, as well as how to query the data. The link to that video is in the description down below. Now, in case you're new to this channel, my name is Tim Corey, and my goal is to make learning C# and other related languages as easy as possible for you. If that sounds good to you, hit the subscribe button to hear all about the videos I release. And if you feel like you might want to take your learning to the next level, there's a link in the description to my mailing list. That's where you get insider news and discounts on the paid courses that I offer. All right, so let's jump right into the topic. Now, the first place I want to spend some time isn't even Visual Studio. It's this website, connectionstrings.com. Now, this is the heart of how to talk to a database or external data. And in fact, if you can see down here, it says connect to, and it's got an awful big list of different places you can connect, including kind of offbeat ones like Microsoft Project or an AS400. Now, most likely you won't be using most of these, but you will be using a few of them, I'm sure. The first and most popular one would be Microsoft SQL Server. So let's start there and look at what this site has to offer. Now, if you see down here, I'll scroll real quick. There's a number of different ways you can connect to SQL Server. It all depends on the options and which version. And so they list here which versions this one supports. Now, these first two right here, and this is SQL Server specific, but these first two are the most important, and typically that's how they lay the page out. The ones that are most common or most important, or the ones that use the most, they put at the top. So if you're going to connect to a Microsoft SQL Server, either this one or this one is the important one for you to know. So let's start with figuring out what the different parts are, and then we'll discuss at the end why they're different. So the first part of this connection string says the server equals. Now what that's identifying is where the database is actually located, which machine. Now it says my server address. You replace that string with the IP address of your server, or if it's on the same machine as what you're on right now, so your code runs on the same machine as your database, you'd use just a dot. But what this is a way to identify which machine on the network you're going to talk to. So if you had this machine or the SQL Server on a different machine, you could put the IP address there, and this connection string would say, okay, the server is located on a different machine, here's how to get to it, and put the IP address. So it's very important to know where your server is located. Now, just a quick note, if your server is located on a different machine, you have to make sure the firewall on that other machine has been correctly adjusted to allow SQL Server traffic. By default, they do not allow SQL Server traffic to come inbound. So you need to change that. So that's the server. Now there's one other tweak, and let's look at the third connection string we see for a SQL Server instance. In my course where I build a C# application, where I build Tournament Tracker, I actually use a different instance than the default. Now if you use just dot up here, that would indicate this machine, and it would indicate the default instance. If you put an IP address and that's it, that would indicate a different machine, but the default instance of SQL. However, if you've installed SQL on a different instance, a named instance, then what you do is you put / in the instance name. Now you may be already thinking, oh man, I'm lost. I'm not sure what an instance of SQL really means. Here's how it works in simplistic terms. When you first install SQL Server onto a machine, it uses the default instance unless you were to change it. You wouldn't change it unless you knew what you were doing, hopefully. So therefore, if you're not sure, it's probably the default instance. However, like in my case, I had SQL Server 2012 installed on my machine. But then I wanted to use SQL Server 2016. So what I did was I installed a second copy of Microsoft SQL Server. The problem is they both can't use the same default for their name. So therefore, my second installation, I had to give a name other than just the default. Therefore, I called it SQL 2016. So my connection string was dot for the server name, since I'm on the same machine as my SQL Server. So it's dot / SQL 2016. But like I said, if you don't have 2 copies of SQL Server installed on your machine or the machine you're talking to, you probably don't need to worry about that. Now that's different than having 2 databases. The installation of SQL happens one time, typically. The number of databases that can hold is many. So don't think because I have 2 databases, I have 2 SQL servers. You don't. It's only if you specifically go back to the installer and install a separate second copy of Microsoft SQL Server. So that's a little more advanced. Like I said, if you're not sure, don't do this server instance. Ignore the / and the my instance name. Don't do that one. Do just the actual name of your server or dot for local. So that's the first part, the server, where the database is located. Next, for SQL Server, we have a database name. Now, like I said, you can have more than one database on one SQL Server. So what it's asking for is which database are you planning to connect to? Now, there's a little confusion about this, so I want to make sure I clarify this. When you specify a database name here, that does not mean you can only talk to that database with this connection string. What it means instead is, by default, it's going to assume this database. So a full path or the full name for a table actually starts with the database name. A lot of times when you access a table or a stored procedure, people just use the table name or stored procedure name. So say your table is called Table 1. They would say, well, select star from Table 1. But in Microsoft SQL Server, what that's actually doing is assuming 3 things. It's assuming which server you're on. It's assuming which database you're talking about. And it's assuming which owner that owns the table. So a fully qualified table name and stored procedure name has 4 parts: the server, the database, the owner, and the actual name. So with this connection string, we know what server we're on, and we know now what database we're going to be talking to, or at least primarily. And so it will default these first 2 based upon this connection string. So if we do not specify all 4 parts, these 2 things right here will fill in the blanks as to what to default those first 2 parts to. Now a database owner that's usually DBO is the, again, default. That is assumed based upon SQL Server saying That's the default owner. And there are settings in SQL Server to change that, but typically people don't. So that's how it knows to assume the third part. So these first two allow for the assumption of where that object is located. So what that means is you have to have this part, or at least I'm pretty sure you do. If you don't, that would mean that there would be no assumption, and so assume master, because that's what SQL Server assumes. But you really should include this part and put the database you're planning on working with. Personally, even if I'm connecting to the same SQL Server and just different databases, I'll create separate connection strings for each. It just makes it a little cleaner because then I can reference each connection string based upon the database name, and I know, okay, that's where I'm going to be talking to. So there's server and database name. Next, in this connection string, we have a user ID and a password. Now down here, so far we've been the same, server and database, but now we have trusted connection equals true. So here's the difference. In Microsoft SQL Server, we have two options for database security. We can use the Windows authentication, or we can use SQL authentication. SQL authentication is a username and password. And that's where that comes in. That username and password is not your Windows username and password. It's one that's put right into Microsoft's SQL. So this would be something you'd specify in SQL and say, I'm going to create a new user. The username will be, and you give it a username, and the password will be this. And so that would be what this would be set up for. Alternatively, if you said, nope, I want to take the permissions from the logged in user, you would use trusted connection equals true. So here's where people start to get a little concerned. Username and password in clear text. That should make you a little concerned. And while we're not going to go into it in full detail in this video, because this is more about just the actual connection and not worrying about, again, how to connect and some other things. But instead, I do want to talk with a little bit just so that we're kind of a little more comfortable with this. Because I don't want you rejecting this out of hand as not useful or should never use it. So, username and password being stored in a text file, not as big a deal as you'd think. And here's why. Whoever has access to your application has these permissions. So whether they see the username and password or not, they still have that level of access. In fact, if you tried to hide this, they could probably still find it out by listening to the network connection, because they control one side of it. So therefore, it's not even a man-in-the-middle attack. They can just listen to their own network traffic. So why isn't it a big deal? Well, if they have access to delete users and delete data and mess up your SQL Server in some nasty way, well, that should mean that you trust them enough to have that permission. Otherwise, you shouldn't give them that permission. So don't ever put an administrative login name and password in this file. Never. And I don't often say never and always, because there's usually an edge case that might be true. But here's the deal. I can't think of a reason why this should have unlimited rights. I just can't. You should lock this username and password down to just what the user should have access to. Now, it makes it a little easier if you do a trusted connection equals true. And the reason I say that is because it actually takes the credentials from Windows. Now, it doesn't transmit them. It just says they've already logged into this machine, and I know they are this person. Therefore, they're allowed to connect to this server as this person. Now, this doesn't typically work across a network. The exception to that would be if you're on a Active Directory domain. Now, for those of you who are not in a corporate network, that probably means nothing. So ignore it. But if you are in a corporate network where your credentials come from a centralized server and you can log on different machines with those same credentials, this would work across the network. Or at least as long as the SQL Server is set up to allow Windows credentials. So it seems a little more safe, and in some ways it is, because it's very easy then to say, well, Bob has these permissions, but Sally has these permissions. And therefore, if Bob logs into Windows, then we'll give Bob his access versus Sally's access. It's a little harder to do that here, but it is possible. It's just, again, harder. What you would need to do is, instead of taking this blindly from the file, this username and password, you would need to, in your application, ask for them to log in, capture a username and password, and overwrite these values when you're actually talking to the SQL Server. That would mean giving them a separate set of credentials that are only usable on Microsoft SQL. That's a little more work, but it's possible. Now again, you can lock down your SQL Server to only give them the rights they actually need to have. For instance, if they only ever read data, say it's a reporting application you're creating. Well, reports don't typically write data to a SQL Server. They typically just consume the data. Therefore, you give that user read-only access. That's great to have because that means it can't mess anything up. One of my favorite ways to lock down a database is to have everything go through a stored procedure. And the reason why is because then I can say, here, this user right here only has access to execute stored procedures. They can't read what the table names are even. They can't log into the database. They can't edit data. They can't update data. They can't delete data. They can't do anything except what these stored procedures allow them to do. So that's a nice check and balance to have. That's my personal favorite. So we're getting a little far afield for this demonstration, but I want to talk a little bit about security, just to keep you a little more comfortable with these two options. So we've got our server name, we've got our database name, and now we have username and password, or we have trusted connection equals true. So those are the most common two for SQL Server. But what if you're not using Microsoft SQL Server? Well, no worries. Coming back to this main page, there's an awful lot of options here. One option might be, and I shudder a little bit at this because I'm not a big fan, but one option might be Microsoft Access. Maybe you have access to the Maybe you have access to these databases and you can send them along with your application. And they are convenient that way. Well, standard security right here. This one's a little bit different because it says, first of all, the provider. Well, we have to specify what the driver is essentially that we're talking to. How do you know this? Well, because connectionstrings.com provided it. Just copy and paste it. The data source is just where is that database located. And then finally, persist security info equals false. And that's all it really is to connecting to a Access database. Now, if you have a database password, that's a bit more of a headache actually. So there's the connection string for you, but read this down here, there's some problems with the encryption scheme. And so you really need to back down to the 2007 encryption method in order to use a connection string from a .NET resource like C#. So that's a little more of a problem. There's other possibilities like network location. So if you're on network, use that instead. And there's other options as well you can look through on your own time. But that's pretty simple. Essentially, copy and paste this and just change data source to the location of your file. Now, if you want to go more of the open source or more open source friendly route, one of the options might be MySQL. Again, real simple. Server name, we're familiar with that. Database name, we're familiar with that. User ID and password, same deal. The only tricky thing, if you want to add a port number, there's how you do it. So there's also things you can do with encryption, new and old methods, multiple servers, forcing encryption, SSL, other fun stuff. But essentially, you find the one that fits your needs, you copy it, you paste it into your connection string location, and just change these values. Wherever it says equals, change that value afterwards. And that value should be whatever is on your machine, not what somebody else gave you. All right, so those are 3 different options of connecting to 3 different database versions. So Access, MySQL, and SQL Server. You could go with SQLite if you'd like. That's a fun little one. That's even easier. Data source is just the location, and the version is 3. All right. So there's a lot of different options here depending on what you want to talk to. But once you have the connection string that works for you, let's just copy this one. I've got something similar. Then you just go over to your Visual Studio. And here I have a project open I've been working on, just kind of playing around on different things. And I've opened up the App.config. Now this is typically where we store our connection strings. And the reason why is because this App.config, or a web.config if you're on a web project, the App.config is changeable while your application is running. Worst case, you have to restart your application. That's the biggest deal you have to do. But otherwise, it's just a matter of changing this file, saving it, and your changes are live. And you can change this file using Notepad, something simple like that, a text editor of any kind. If you can avoid it, don't hard code any connection information directly into your C# code. What that does is it locks you down to only using that particular server, that particular database with those particular credentials. And you may think that, well, I'm never going to change those things. But the reality is, down the road, you probably will. So just don't hard code it. So there is a specific section you can add to the configuration file in the app.config or web.config. So after the opening configuration tag, as long as there's not already one in place. Now this is pretty simple. I only have a startup tag inside here at this level. But open up a new tag and say connection strings. And again, IntelliSense works, which is great. Inside connection strings, you're going to add a new one, give it a name. So the name can be anything you want, but this will refer to that particular connection. So if my database name is called tournaments, I might call my connection string tournaments. That way, it's very obvious that if I'm using the tournaments connection string, I'm talking to the tournaments database. So next, you can say connection string equals, and we're going to paste in that connection string. Now, I would change this to be dot to use my local machine, no instance, so a default instance. The database name, tournaments. And trusted connection equals true means I'm going to use my Windows credentials. Now for a SQL connection, and this isn't true for all of them, just for SQL, But after the closing quotes of the connection string, I need to add one more thing, and that's provider name. And I would say system.data.SQL client. Now, how did I know to do that? Well, that's what Google helps with, really. And so this is the other part of connection strings. They might not always work. Even if you go to connectionstrings.com, there may be a problem with your specific style of connection. Or maybe you typed something wrong. Or in this case, maybe you need to add a provider name. Now, this particular provider name specifies that we're going to use the built-in Microsoft SQL connection client. So the provider name is system.data.SQL client. Microsoft tells you about that if you read through the documentation, or if you just Google the internet for C# SQL connection string. It will tell you all about the provider name. So that's one option for setting up a connection string. Now, what if you had two different databases? Well, that's pretty simple. What you do is you would go back to the connectionstrings.com, find the connection string you want, let's say an Access database this time, copy the connection string that applies to you, come back in here, and inside connection strings, add another connection string. Name equals, let's call this my guest book database. And the connection string equals, and there's my connection string. Now it wrapped off the page because it's so large, and because on the connection strings page, they wrapped it as well in order to make it smaller. Therefore, I have to take that wrap out. There we go. So now it's not wrapped anymore. The data source, let's change this. We'll call it, it's an temp file. And it's, instead of my access file, I'd probably call it guestbook.accdb. So now that's all I need to connect to the guestbook database, which is an Access database. So this is SQL, this is Access. Maybe if you're storing the same type of data but in two different databases, and maybe the user has options for both, I might label these right in the connection string name. Tournament SQL and guestbook ACC. That way it's a little more obvious which database type it is, especially if you wanted to call this tournaments. Then it says tournament SQL and tournament ACC. So you know right away this is the Access connection string, this is a SQL connection string. Now, it doesn't make sense. For my case, I don't really care about that because I know which one's which based upon the type. So it's up to you. That name, the only thing it's valuable for is actually talking to the web.config or app.config file and getting this connection string. Microsoft has built in a tool to talk to this config file and pull out a connection string based upon its name. Therefore, it's very easy just to say, give me the tournaments connection string. So that's the only place that you use that name. Now, the last thing I want to cover in here is the fact that this connection string area right here is meant to deal with ODBC connections. Now, it does other connections as well to some extent, but in general, it deals with ODBC connections. An ODBC connection is an open database connectivity connection. And it's essentially a standard that says there are certain parts that you have, and one of them is a connection string that gives the information to talk to your database. And so if your database can talk ODBC, then you can put your connection string in here. Now, some databases don't use this style of connection string. They use something different. And so if you're going to use a edge case or a maybe even a newer database style, it might not fit inside this connection strings area. It might not make sense to put the information here. So it is up to you to kind of look at, how do I connect to that database using C#? So even Google that or look through the documentation. Usually they tell you and usually give you an example. If it uses a connection string, you would do the same exact pattern you're doing here, where whatever connection string they give you, you essentially just paste it in this section where it says connection string equals, and then you can access it using the name. For anything else, it's really up to you to figure out how to connect to that database. But here's the cool part. If you want to connect to a database and you can't figure out how to get C# to connect to it, write down the comments down below. Say, I'm trying to connect to this database type. I can't figure out the connection string information or how to connect to it. I'll do some Google search of my own. I'll look through my records if I've connected to it before, and I'll try and give you a hand connecting to it. All right? So that's the essentials of connection strings. We didn't actually use these yet, but if you, again, there's a video down in the comments where I actually use a connection string to talk to SQL. From that, it's the same or a similar method for connecting to any system that uses the connection strings. All right? I would love to know your thoughts down below in the comments. Leave me a comment. Let me know what confused you, what more you want to see, and what you liked. Also, I'd love a thumbs up if you liked this video. I hope you found this video enjoyable. Check out the rest of the videos I have to offer. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Thanks.